Part 9. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 81. After hearing the voice of the leader of the Ji sect that day, Murong Kong's face suddenly turned ugly. His face turned pale for a while, and at this time, there was also a wave of turmoil in his heart. You should know that this ordinary person might be able to let it go, but the leader of the Tianji sect spoke in person, and naturally his name was Murong Kong, and his face began to look ugly. Murong Kong was pacing back and forth, his eyes a bit erratic and his expression a little dazed. At this time, after seeing Murong Kong like this, Lin Yu only had a slight sneer on his lips, and a hint of contempt flashed in his eyes. If the lord of the city is afraid, I can leave temporarily. In fact, it doesn't matter. After Murong Kong heard Lin Yu finish speaking, some complex colors flashed in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. Actually, if I were alone, it wouldn't be a big deal for young hero, but after all, there are countless people in my city. If something really goes wrong, then I'm afraid. At this time, Murong Kong had a look of helplessness in his eyes, and a wry smile appeared on his lips. Of course, Lin Yu was also aware of Murong Kong's concerns, and the friendship between the two parties was not very deep, so at this time he just shook his head and smiled, and then turned his head to look towards Murong Kong. He glanced at him, a bit of amusement flashing in his eyes. Actually, it doesn't matter. After all, the friendship between the two of us is not very deep, so there is no need to be so polite. I am also aware of your concerns. Let's put this matter aside for the time being. Thank you Lord City Lord for your hospitality today. I can't thank you enough. Come. If I have the chance, I will definitely return this favor to the Lord. At this time, after Lin Yu finished speaking, Murong Kong's eyes evoked some complex colors, and then he forced a smile from the corner of his mouth. Young hero, I'm telling the truth. In fact, it's nothing. It's just a small effort. This time, young hero, I'm going to be in danger. Please take care of yourself, young hero. After Lin Yu heard what Murong Kong said, he just waved and smiled. Actually, it doesn't matter, but I am very grateful to you for hosting a banquet for me today. Lin Yu turned his head and glanced at the three women. The three women instantly understood what Lin Yu meant, and then they stood up and walked out. At this time, Murong Fu's eyes were still staring directly at the three women. It was as if his eyes were on the three women's bodies. At this time, he couldn't help but sigh so faintly, and the corners of his mouth also provoking a bit of a wry smile. Oh, what a pity. These three peerless beauties have to go eat rice dumplings with this boy who doesn't know how high the sky is. It's really amazing that such a beauty in the world has to accompany this boy to his death. Regret. Murong Kong glanced at Murong Fu angrily, and a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes. You really don't know how high the world is. Do you know that the guy just now is connected to the Tianji sect? If someone who dares to challenge someone doesn't have any real ability, do you think he would dare to go directly to Tianji sect with these three women? After Murong Fu heard what Murong Kong said, his pupils suddenly enlarged, a bit of surprise flashed in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. What do you mean? I mean, this time all of us thought that this guy didn't know how high the sky was and he should lose, but in fact that's not the case. Maybe he can't lose. After Murong Fu heard what Murong Kong said, his eyes were full of contempt. At this time, he waved his hands and smiled. Can't lose. In my opinion, that's not necessarily the case. After all, although this boy his strength may be a bit impressive, but some things cannot be solved by strength alone. It is difficult to defeat him with 2 fists, and with 4 hands. If he wants to break through the mountain alone, it is simply a fantasy. At this moment, after Murong Kong heard what Murong Fu said, his pupils suddenly enlarged, and a bit of surprise flashed in his eyes, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. What you said is indeed true. But there are some things that can't be said. If you don't believe it, the two of us can actually make a bet. What do you think? I made a bet with my son that this was really rare, but Murong didn't care about it. Although Murongfu seemed arrogant, domineering, greedy and lustful, he still inherited some of Murong's excellent genes. What do you want to bet on? Bet on whether he will lose or not. What about the bet? If you win, then this great return pill will be yours. If you lose, just follow my arrangements and go to the alien beast mountain range to practice. At this moment, after hearing what Murong said, Murongfu's eyes evoked some strange colors, and then he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. Isn't your bet a bit high? Murong's eyes were staring straight at Murongfu, a teasing smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a trace of amusement flashed in his eyes. Is it big? I don't think so. Besides, going to the alien beast mountain range to experience this is also a good thing for you. What do you think? Murong's eyes were as bright as fire. At this time, Murongfu also knew that this was probably a trap set by his father. Don't say that this was just a trap. I was afraid that even if it was a mountain of swords and a sea of fire, he had to go through it. Just fine. So at this time, a helpless smile appeared on the corner of Murongfu's mouth, and a trace of helplessness flashed in his eyes. Well, it doesn't matter, Ginger is still hot anyway, and you have already planned it for a long time. I'm afraid it will have no effect even if I don't agree. Murongfu's eyes were staring straight at Murong. At this time, Murong couldn't help laughing, and he turned his head and glanced at Murongfu. Actually, you should also know that these are troubled times now. Don't blame Dad. Born in troubled times, the weak are inherently guilty. That is original sin and is indelible. But I still have Daddy. Your cultivation level is so high, and your beasts have reached the Lord level. Putting aside everything else, protecting me will naturally be no problem. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 82. At this time, after Murong heard what Murongfu said, 3 black lines suddenly appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. He rolled his eyes at Murongfu angrily. I really don't understand what you, a little guy, are thinking about every day. Although my realm and strength are on this land, it may be reasonable, but looking at the entire continent, my strength is basically it's not worth mentioning, just like a drop in the ocean. At this time, after Murongfu heard what Murong said, some complicated colors flashed in his eyes. He couldn't help but raised his eyebrows slightly, but after a while he didn't say anything more. After Lin Yu left here with Qiu Yao, Yaya, and Bai Shui suddenly stopped in front of Lin Yu. Do you have to do this? Do you know that if you have to do this, the few of us will most likely become your scapegoats by then, so I think we might as well kill the other 2 northern Pluto bears first. Once it's subdued, we'll make plans later when we have the strength to fight. But just after Bai Shui finished speaking, the voice of the Beiming bear sounded like this. One of my brothers should be on top of the mountain gate you mentioned. I have sensed his presence, so he must have sensed my presence as well. At this time, Bai Shui heard Beiming Xiong. After saying this, his pupils suddenly enlarged, and a look of disbelief flashed in his eyes. At this moment, Lin Yu gently held Bai Shui's shoulders. His eyes were staring at Bai Shui, and there was a bit of sincerity in those eyes. It doesn't matter. In fact, you can rest assured that I will never leave you no matter what. As for what you just said, maybe it is indeed true, so you will find a safe place to hide in a while. As for the rest, there's no need to worry about it. Although Lin Yu's voice was not loud, there was a flavor that could not be rejected in his words. At this time, Bai Shui could not help but shake her head slightly. No, absolutely not, How can we ask you to take risks alone, but both sisters can find a safe place and wait for us to come back. Yaya and Chiuyao looked at each other, and then they couldn't help but shook their heads slightly. Sister Bai Shui, who do you think we are? Do you think we are like the kind of people who are greedy for life and afraid of death, humans? We're not. So we're going to this time. After Lin Yu heard what the three women said, he felt moved in his heart, but at this time he also realized the danger of going to the mountains this time. You three should find a safe place and hide for the time being. If I go there by myself, I'm sure I can escape unscathed. Trust me. Lin Yu's eyes were quite firm, and at this moment, the three women looked at each other with a bit of reluctance in their eyes, but. Lin Yu raised his eyebrows slightly. There's nothing special about it, just do as I say in this matter. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he summoned the space-time beast. Go to Tianya Valley, you should be able to get there. At this time, when Lin Yu looked so determined, the space-time beast couldn't help but turn its head and glance in his direction. He couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly, and there seemed to be a bit of complexity flashing through his eyes. Have you really thought about doing this now? I have to tell you that this Tianji sect is far from being as simple as you think. This Tianji sect is a behemoth. If you want to rely on your own power, if I have the strength to defeat this behemoth, in my opinion, I'm afraid it's still a little short of it. At this moment, after Lin Yu heard what the space-time beast said, something strange flashed in his eyes. At this time, he couldn't help but frown slightly. He frowned and turned his head towards the space-time beast. Glanced. Do you know something? If you know something, tell me quickly. This will be of great use to me. At this moment, after hearing what Lin Yu said, the space-time beast's eyes flashed with some complexity, and then he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. Do you really want to listen? The space-time beast's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, seeming to be a little confused as to whether or not to tell Lin Yu what he said. Lin Yu was so serious at that time and nodded. Of course you have to listen. Actually, in this Tianji sect, I felt a familiar power. This power seemed to come from my companion, but the power in my companion seemed to be in a person's body at this moment. Sealed. A bit of confusion flashed across Lin Yu's eyes, and then he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. At this time, when the space-time beast heard what Lin Yu said, he couldn't help but shake his head. No, it's not sealed. At this moment, Lin Yu was just like the 2-foot-tall monk, confused. If it's not sealed, then what is it? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the space-time beast, and a bit of complexity seemed to flash through his eyes. Of course. At this time, the space-time beast suddenly paused, with a hint of helplessness in his eyes and a wry smile on his lips. What is it? Tell me quickly, I don't understand what is so worthy of your hesitation. At this time, the corner of the mouth of the space-time beast raised a bitter smile. It should be that someone forced his power to be absorbed, which means that my companion should be dead now, so I also feel a strong resentment in his power. That resentment is dormant in it. I think that person must have nightmares every night after falling asleep. After hearing what the space-time beast said, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a complex light, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly, and there seemed to be a little strangeness in his eyes. The space-time beast suddenly stood up and rushed towards Lin Yu. It was very fast. At this moment, after seeing this scene, Lin Yu couldn't help but flash a little panic in his eyes, but he also knew that the space-time beast would never come to harm him, so he didn't dodge. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 83. But at this moment, a majestic and vast force directly penetrated the space where he was originally. If there was no time and space, I am afraid that even if he was not dead this time, he would probably have to lie in bed for a long time. When Lin Yu saw this scene, he frowned, a strange light flashed in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. How is it possible? Why is it like this? That guy has already started to take action. I will send a few of them to Tianya Valley first. Tianya Valley is relatively safe. After all, it is a neutral force. Lin Yu nodded gently. Hurry up, if it's too slow, I'm afraid something might happen. Lin Yu's eyes were quite solemn. He turned his head and glanced at the three women. There is no time to waste now. You should quickly step on the space-time beast, otherwise you will think about it later. I'm afraid it's too late to leave. Ha ha ha, little guy, if you want to leave now, I'm afraid it's too late. How can any of my disciples of TNG sect be bullied like you? Since you have bullied my disciples, you will naturally have to pay some price. This should be it's very reasonable. At this time, the man's eyes were blazing, and Lin Yu couldn't help but half squinted his eyes after hearing what the guy said, with a somewhat complicated look in his eyes. What exactly do you want to do? You don't have to worry about what I want to do for the time being. Anyway, there are some things that you can't control. If you want to survive, I can give you a chance for you to survive, but it's hard to say whether you can grasp it. The man was wearing a black robe, and at this moment, the corner of Lin Yu's mouth was twitching with a bit of sneer. As soon as he thought, the earth-shaking bear appeared beside him, and the earth-shaking bear fell on the ground. At this time, I felt a little bit trembling. When the man in black robe saw the earth-shaking bear next to Lin Yu, a slight sneer appeared on his lips, and his eyes were full of contempt and disdain. I thought your little guy could be so powerful, but in the end you just raised such a big stupid bear. In my opinion, you'd better summon your time and space beast quickly. This big stupid bear is simply useless. Not enough. The man in black robe stared at Lin Yu with his eyes fixed on him. There seemed to be a bit of coldness in his eyes, and the murderous intention in his body was quietly invading. But to Lin Yu, these were nothing at all. A slight sneer appeared on the corner of Lin Yu's mouth, and a cold light flashed in his eyes. It's just a small trick, do you really think you can bluff me? It's simply ridiculous and stupid. Lin Yu's tone was neither urgent nor too hasty, and a cold breath quietly emerged from his body. That cold breath made people feel a bit indescribable. I don't know why, but at this moment, after feeling the cold aura emanating from Lin Yu's body, the face of the man in black suddenly changed. How is it possible? How could your boy have such terrifying strength? This is absolutely impossible. Lin Yu glanced coldly at the man in black robes, with a hint of sneer at the corner of his mouth. A cold light flashed in his eyes, and the murderous intent quietly emerged from his body. Nothing is impossible. If you want to kill me, it's not difficult to say it, but if I want to kill you, it's not difficult either. No need to say more, just do it quickly. Lin Yu gritted his teeth and spoke every word. At this moment, after hearing what Lin Yu said, the man in black robes had some complex colors flashing in his eyes. At this moment, he couldn't help but feel entangled for a while. You are really beyond my expectation, but so what? Some things are far beyond your control. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly laughed. He laughed very happily, as if he had heard the funniest joke in the world. He laughed wildly, ha ha ha, I don't know if there is anything that I can't control, but I know one thing very well. If you don't leave now, I'm afraid the people from TNG sect will come soon. The man's expression suddenly darkened, a hint of sneer curled up at the corner of his mouth. He turned his head, staring at Lin Yu, and the killing intent in his body suddenly spurted out. What do you mean by this? I am originally a member of the TNG section. My people are here. What do I have to be afraid of? At this time, the man's eyes were blazing, and at this time, Lin Yu's mouth was a bit sarcastic, and the sarcastic smile became more and more obvious. It's ridiculous to say it. It's extremely ridiculous. If you're not afraid of the people of TNG sect, then why do you wear a mask? In this case, don't you think it's a little ridiculous? After hearing what Lin Yu said, the man's pupils suddenly enlarged, and a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes. His eyes were staring at Lin Yu, but after a moment, the man suddenly smiled like this. He smiled very happily. Ha ha ha, not bad, I'm quite capable. I can see these things. I'm in trouble today. However, I just wanted to take a look at you. We will naturally meet again someday. At that time, as the saying goes, green mountains never change and green waters flow forever. After years of separation, we will eventually meet again. After the man finished speaking, he suddenly disappeared in front of Lin Yu. Lin Yu stared straight at the direction where the guy disappeared for a long time, and then he couldn't help but shake his head. Interesting, it's really interesting. A moment later, several men wearing TNG sect costumes walked over, led by a middle-aged man. When the middle-aged man saw Lin Yu, his eyes were quite contemptuous. Boy, let me ask you, I didn't see a suspicious guy just now. If I did, tell me quickly, you understand? Lin Yu didn't like the man's tone. There was a bit of coldness in his eyes, and then he glanced at the guy coldly. I didn't see it. Of course, Lin Yu knew that those guys were probably far away now. It would be impossible for these guys with low IQ to find that person. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 84. But after Lin Yu said this, the disciples of TNG sect stood up suddenly. Their eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and a bit of coldness flashed in their eyes. Boy, do you know who this person is in front of you? I advise you to be more honest. He is a worshipper in our section. If you know him well, kneel down and kowtow a few times. Let this matter be over. If you are still so arrogant and rude, then don't blame us for being rude. Lin Yu's lips curved up into a sneer. The offerings in the sect are indeed very prestigious, but I just don't know how this offering compares to your great elder. After the Wiji sect disciples heard what Lin Yu said, they couldn't help laughing. At this time, they looked at Lin Yu as if they were looking at a mentally retarded person. Ha ha ha, it's really funny what you say. You don't need to ask this. Of course, the status of the great elder in our sect is higher than that of the worshipper. No one had realized what Lin Yu was talking about, but the worshipper was suddenly startled, and a bit of solemnity flashed in his eyes. He turned his head and stared intently. Looking at Lin Yu, a bit of solemnity flashed in his eyes. Do you know the great elder in our sect? After Lin Yu heard what Zhongfang said, he couldn't help but shook his head. I don't know him. 3 simple words blurted out from his mouth. At this time, when the worshipper heard Lin Yu say this, he was so relieved. But the next sentence made the worshipper and the disciple of the Wiji section everyone was shocked. Although I don't know him, I have fought against him before. His strength is not weak, but compared to me, he is still a little behind. The disciples of the Wiji sect around here raised a bit of sneer at the corners of their mouths after hearing Lin Yu's words, and their eyes were full of contempt. Ha ha ha, ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. Do you think we will believe you? You have fought against our great elder, and you don't even know how much you weigh, yet you dare to say that. Lin Yu's expression darkened, and then a cold killing intent suddenly emerged from his body. That cold aura swept over all of them, and the people around them couldn't help but swallow their saliva. Then Lin Yu waved his big hand and softly uttered 3 words, shake the earth bear. After Lin Yu finished speaking, the earth-shaking bear suddenly appeared beside him. The earth-shaking bear turned its head and glanced at Lin Yu. Master, do you want to fight? There was quite a bit of excitement in the eyes of this earth-shaking bear. Lin Yu turned his head towards them and just glanced coldly, with a bit of sneer on the corners of his mouth and eyes. It was full of contempt and ridicule. Maybe you shouldn't ask me about this. You should ask them, do you want to fight? Lin Yu said in a leisurely manner. These Wuji sect disciples were certainly not vegetarians. Some complicated colors flashed in their eyes, and then they couldn't help but frown slightly. You actually own a Lord-level beast. How is this possible? Who are you? Their eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, with some strange colors flashing in their eyes. At this time, there was a trace of sneer on the corner of Lin Yu's mouth. Don't care who I am, tell me if you can beat me. Of course, these people knew that with such a Lord-level beast beside them, they would certainly not be Lin Yu's opponents, so at this time, they couldn't help but shake their heads, with a bit of panic flashing in their eyes. We can't beat you. How can we beat you, a master like you? This time, I hope you can show your dignity and treat us like nothing. After Lin Yu heard what he said, a slight sneer suddenly appeared at the corner of his mouth, and a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes. You said you wanted me to treat you like a fart, so I will you treat it like a fart, right? But I don't want to, what do you think? The people around looked at each other. You look at me, I look at you. They didn't say a word at this moment, for fear that if they said something wrong, they would make the old man in front of them unhappy. Today I also give you a chance. If you crawl back like a dog from here, then I can forget about what happened before. Of course, you don't have to agree. If you don't agree, what will happen next? But it's hard to say. Lin Yu's tone was neither urgent nor slow. After the group of people heard what Lin Yu said, they looked at me and I looked at you. The look of panic in their eyes could not be concealed at all. Live. If you don't want to, then I can reluctantly fight with you a few times, so I think you should also know what to do. Lin Yu's eyes were as bright as a torch. These people looked at each other, and then they looked at each other and gritted their teeth. In the end, the offering was still there, and he just lay down on the ground. There was a bit of unwillingness in his eyes. At this moment, after seeing the offering, Lin Yu's lips also curled up with a bit of ridicule. If you are unwilling, the two of us can come here, and I don't mind a few tricks. Lin Yu deliberately emphasized the word mind very strongly, and naturally the worshipper did not dare to say anything more at this time. After all, he also understood the power and terror of this Lord-level alien beast. So at this time, he just shook his head and smiled. I'm sorry, how dare I mess with your class? I'll get out of here, I'll get out of here. After the man finished speaking, he just lay down on the ground, and then rolled down into the distance. The other Tianji sect disciples around him also began to roll down one after another. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he nodded with satisfaction. A somewhat playful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a trace of amusement flashed in his eyes. Yes, this is really good. It looks much more pleasing to the eye. It is also ridiculous to say it. I really don't understand why these guys want to come here and humiliate themselves. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 85. At this time, those people felt extremely humiliated in their hearts, but to Lin Yu, this was nothing. At this moment, there was a bit of sneer on the corner of his mouth. Among the Tianji sect, an old man wearing a purple robe stared straight out. The towering mountain peaks in the ethereal place seemed to have some aura, which made people feel relaxed and happy. This little guy is really interesting. Even our Tianji sect doesn't give him any face. From my point of view, he really has the heart and courage of a leopard. At this time, the leader of Tianji sect was of course extremely furious. A bit of coldness flashed through his eyes, and the fierce killing intent on his body was released without reservation. I have something to say, I don't know whether to say it or not. The person who came here was none other than the Great Elder of Tianji section. The Great Elder stepped forward and stared directly at the leader of Tianji sect. I don't know why the Great Elder came here this time. If the Great Elder has anything to say, just say it. Mr. De Jong nodded gently, and there seemed to be a bit of solemnity in his eyes. Actually, there is nothing big to talk about, but there is one thing that is indeed important. The sect leader of Tianji sect rarely saw the Great Elder with such a solemn look on his face, and then he nodded lightly. You have something to say? That little guy should have 2 Lord-level alien beasts on him, and one of the alien beasts has the attribute of time and space. You must know what this means. When the master of Tianji sect, Zi Ling Genren, heard what the Great Elder said, his pupils suddenly enlarged, and a look of disbelief flashed in his eyes. What? You said that little guy has 2-headed Lord levels on his body, a strange beast? This is not a child's play, please don't lie to me. Obviously, Master Zi Ling never expected that such a young boy would be carrying such a secret. After the Great Elder heard Master Zi Ling say this, his eyes also evoked some complex colors, and then he nodded gently. I absolutely dare not make any false statements. Master Zi Ling half squinted his eyes, and there seemed to be some complex colors in his eyes, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. How is this little guy's skill? Have you checked it out? I always feel that this little guy's skill is extraordinary. If not, how could he have 2 Lord-level beasts at his age? There is a strange beast with the attributes of time and space. The Great Elder and everyone present shook their heads. Elder Wu, I know that you are a person specializing in intelligence. Now let's talk about it. What is going on? Please explain it clearly. After Elder Wu heard what Master Zi Ling said, some complex colors flashed in his eyes, and a bitter smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. According to the current situation, this little guy has no way to go. There is no sect, but they claim to be one sect, and they can be called a group of people. It's hard to explain, but it's quite complicated. At this moment, after Master Zi Ling heard what Elder Wu said, a strange light flashed in his pupils, and then he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. This kid has no sect and is a sect of his own. How is this possible? If that's really the case, he definitely can't have 2 Lord-level beasts at such a young age. I'm afraid this is a bit suspicious. Master Zi Ling's eyes were staring straight at Elder Wu, and at this moment, Elder Wu's mouth also had a bit of a wry smile, and there was a hint of helplessness in his eyes. There is no way, things are still like this after all. Some things are neither clear nor clear, so this. At this moment, Master Zi Ling seemed to have figured out something. At this time, a sinister smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a bit of amusement flashed in his eyes. I think I finally figured out something. What happened? Actually, it's not a big deal. There must be a master behind this little guy. There is no doubt about this. However, this master should be somewhat secretive, so it is inconvenient to take action. Therefore, all parties still don't know this master. Identity. Master Zi Ling was analyzing it logically, and after hearing what Master Zi Ling said, the Great Elder nodded slightly. What Master Zi Ling said is true. In this way, I seem to understand something. Master Zi Ling nodded lightly. In this case, as long as we make this matter secret enough, even that person will be unable to do anything without anyone noticing. It is true that for a person who has some scruples and is afraid of throwing things away, there are some things that he simply cannot do on the bright side. Therefore, having such a person is equivalent to not having anything, and it is not enough to deter anyone. Although they could see clearly, they probably never thought that all of this was not because there was an expert behind Lin Yu, but because of his systematic existence. After the time and space beast sent these women to Tianya Valley, they rushed back directly. When the time and space beast came back, Lin Yu turned his head and glanced at the time and space beast. His eyes seemed to flash a little. Complex color. At this moment, the space-time beast turned around and looked at Lin Yu. A few complex colors flashed in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. How did that strange guy just now deal with it? I always feel that he seems a little strange, but I can't explain what's strange about it. The space-time beast's voice was low and hoarse. After Lin Yu heard what he said, a few complex colors flashed in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. I can't explain what's strange, but it seems that the people of TNG sect should not know his true identity. If you can see him, can you recognize him? Lin Yu's eyes stared straight at the space-time beast, and there seemed to be a few confusions in his eyes. At this time, the space-time beast was also entangled in his heart, and there were some complex colors in his eyes. If we meet, I should be able to feel the disgusting breath on him. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 86. Okay, if you can feel the breath of that annoying guy, that would be great, but there is a problem I have to say. What's the problem? TNG sect has at least 2 or more domain lord level alien beasts. This is a big problem. These domain lord level alien beasts are indeed terrifying. When the time and space beast heard Lin Yu's joking, he couldn't help but half squinted his eyes, and a bit of complexity flashed in his eyes. Actually, it's not a big deal this time. Many things can be left to those many people to do. If you don't be arrogant or impetuous, and don't lose or be discouraged, this time is probably the right way. After Lin Yu heard the time and space beast say this, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. He rolled his eyes at the time and space beast angrily. It doesn't hurt your back when you stand and talk. But it's still you who will be fighting against me for a while, so don't get beat up so badly that you won't be able to get off the stage. I wish you good luck. 3 black lines appeared on the space-time beast's forehead, and he was speechless for a while. Please be kind to me and let me go. I still want to live a few more years. The hoarse voice of the time and space beast has a certain charm to it, and it has a contrasting and cute feeling. Lin Yu also burst out laughing after hearing what the space-time beast said. Ha ha ha, interesting and interesting, it's really interesting. The 2 people were talking and laughing like this, and at this moment, the space-time beast seemed to suddenly remember something. His face darkened, and there was a bit of solemnity in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. Oops, there seems to be someone around here. After Lin Yu heard the words of the space-time beast, a strange color flashed in his pupils, and a somewhat complicated look flashed in his eyes. Of course there are people around here, and there are more than one. After all, it's in front of the TNG sex gate. After the space beast heard what Lin Yu said, a strange light flashed in its eyes, and then it frowned slightly and shook its head. It's not like this. Lin Yu's eyes flashed with confusion. It's not like this. What is that? It's the person lurking in the darkness. After the time and space beast said this, Lin Yu instantly understood what the time and space beast meant. A somewhat playful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a trace of amusement seemed to flash in his eyes. Then he nodded lightly. That person saw the people gathered today just like a mouse seeing a cat, but why did he appear here? Lin Yu's eyes flashed with confusion, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. At this moment, when the time and space beast heard Lin Yu say this, some complicated colors flashed in its eyes, and then it shook its head slightly. I don't know what the reason is, but there is still something wrong. And at this moment, a group of people walked out of the door. The group of people came towards Lin Yu and the space-time beast in a mighty manner, their eyes staring straight at them. Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a hint of amusement. I thought you were so powerful, but it turns out you're just a brat. It's ridiculous that a brat could act like this. The man's words were quite cold, and the murderous intent in his body was quietly released. This middle-aged man in a purple robe gave Lin Yu a great pressure. This powerful sense of oppression made Lin Yu's eyes flash with a bit of panic. The terrifying oppressive feeling on Master Zi Ling's body made everyone lower their heads involuntarily. There was a bit of dodge in their eyes and a bit of panic in their hearts. At this time, there was a bit of sneer on the corner of Lin Yu's mouth, and his eyes were full of ridicule and disdain. If you say they can't do it, how can you do it? I don't think you are just good at it. Talk about others, but never look at yourself correctly. Lin Yu's eyes were as bright as a torch. After hearing what Lin Yu said, Master Zi Ling's eyes flashed with a bit of coldness. At this moment, his eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu. The murderous intent in his eyes began to become more and more obvious. At this moment, Lin Yu took a step forward unhurriedly, with a slight sneer on the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were fixed on Master Zi Ling. What's wrong? Is what I said wrong? Lin Yu's eyes were blazing, and Master Zi Ling nodded slightly at this moment. Then he waved his big hand and let out a roar, "Three-clawed king dragon, come out." Then everyone only saw a mighty-looking giant dragon suddenly appearing in the void. The giant dragon flew up and down and moved left and right. The surrounding space was oppressed by the king dragon. There are faint signs of collapse. After all the people saw this scene, their pupils suddenly enlarged, and a look of disbelief flashed in their eyes. At this moment, they could not help but shook their heads slightly, with a kind of expression in their eyes. Can't believe it. I didn't expect that the headmaster was really angry this time. This time, the headmaster was really. At this moment, the three-clawed dragon exuded an extremely powerful pressure in the void. This terrible pressure made people want to kneel down. Exotic beast, three-clawed dragon domain master level 5, level 15. Qualification, alien, low level. Life, 999999991. Speed, 999999991. Defense, 999999991. Attack, 999999991. Skills, Dragon King destroys the world, Dragon Power. Dragon King destroys the world. The three-clawed dragon activates a skill to instantly extract the vitality in a small area, forming an absolute death prison. Dragon Power, the three-clawed dragon activates a skill and uses its own pressure to make the beasts with lower levels than itself feel submissive. At this moment, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a strange color, and the corners of his mouth distorted into a playful smile. Such an ordinary domain master level beast dares to act rashly. Survival of the beasts, awakening the beast taming system at the beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 87. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the murderous intention in the eyes of the Zi Ling master began to become more and more obvious, and at this moment, a powerful aura suddenly enveloped the void. On everyone's body. Master Zi Ling's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and there was also a sneer at the corner of his mouth. "Little guy, I admire your courage, but I don't like your attitude very much, so you still have to die today. No one I say can save you." After Lin Yu heard Master Zi Ling say this, a slight sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of mockery. "You are really not afraid of the wind and your tongue. It's really ridiculous. How do you think you can do anything to me?" At this moment, Master Zi Ling seemed to have remembered something. There was a bit of sneer on the corners of his mouth, a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes, and there was a hint of murderous intent in his body. Nothing is revealed. The surrounding world suddenly tilted, and a powerful force came out. This extremely powerful force made everyone feel an inexplicable sense of fear. That kind of fear made people feel a bit of unspeakable oppression. The world seemed to be solidified into a monolith, which made everyone's hearts tremble. And just after this moment, a figure suddenly rushed out. The person was extremely fast and came directly in front of Master Zi Ling without saying a word. Then, Master Zi Ling felt his own energy and blood surge. After a while, the man stood firm, and Master Zi Ling could clearly see the man's appearance. This man was wearing a shabby beggar's uniform, which was covered with bags. He was holding an old crutch in his hand, but this crutch was actually carved from spiritual stone jade. After seeing this scene, Master Zi Ling's eyes evoked some complex colors, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. How is that possible? Senior, I'm afraid it's a little inappropriate for you to do it like this. It's against the rules for an old senior to bully a junior like me. After the old man heard what Master Zi Ling said, a somewhat playful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a hint of perfection flashed in his eyes. His eyes were staring straight at Master Zi Ling. And then he couldn't help but shook his head. No, no, many of these things are not what you said. There are some things that even I can't say easily. I can't say it, I can't say it. As the old man spoke, he winked at him. After seeing the old man like this, Zi Ling's eyes evoked some complex colors. Old senior, there is something in your words, but I just don't know what you mean. The old man just shook his head and smiled. It's not interesting, it's just that I'm saving your life. If you persist in your obsession, you will definitely die within half a year, and even your TNG sect will disappear, no matter what do you believe it or not. At this time, Master Zi Ling didn't know why. Although he wanted to refute the old man, he always felt that what the old man said seemed to be true, so his face turned pale at this time. At this time, his eyes were fixed on the old man. He half squinted his eyes, and a complicated light flashed in his eyes. Old senior, if you want to save people, just save people, I won't stop you, but it's a bit boring for you to scare me like this. The old man waved his hand casually, with a bit of amusement flashing in his eyes. Whether you believe it or not, my words have been left here for you anyway. Regardless of whether you care or not, things are already like this. As for how to make a decision, everything depends on you, it doesn't matter to me anyway. After the old man finished speaking, he stepped back and came to Lin Yu. At this time, the old man looked at Lin Yu with his eyes straight, and then nodded with satisfaction. Not bad, it's really good. At this moment, Lin Yu was stared at so directly by such a crazy old man. Some complicated colors flashed through his eyes, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. However, in line with the principle of respecting the elderly and loving the young, Lin Yu he nodded lightly towards the old man and smiled. This old man doesn't know why you are looking at me like this. After the old man heard what Lin Yu said, a teasing smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a trace of amusement flashed in his eyes. Then you have to guess, why am I looking at you like this? Lin Yu was confused by this crazy old man's question, so at this time he subconsciously shook his head, with some complex colors flashing in his eyes. Senior, this junior doesn't know. When the crazy old man heard what Lin Yu said, he couldn't help laughing, and then he nodded gently, with a hint of amusement flashing in his eyes, and a hint of amusement at the corner of his mouth. A teasing smile. Ha ha ha, you don't know, it's so rare to be confused, it's so rare to be confused. Lin Yu just smiled, and then said nothing more, and a moment later, a figure suddenly jumped out, and then the crazy old man's face suddenly condensed. There was something strange in his eyes. The crazy old man waved his hand, and then the man was thrown out. At this time, Lin Yu looked carefully and found that the man was the guy who had just stood behind the head of TNG sect. The head of TNG sect glared at the man fiercely. Nonsense, who allowed you to do this nonsense? How could you be exposed before others took action? The head of TNG sect stared at the guy coldly. At this time, there was a bit of unwillingness in the man's eyes, and then he knelt on the ground with a plop. I'm sorry, master, I was indeed reckless just now. I just couldn't stand it. They don't take you seriously, master, and they are simply bullying too much. They deserve to die. The man turned his head and stared at Lin Yu with his eyes. There was a bit of coldness in his eyes, and the murderous intent on his body quietly emanated. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly laughed. It's really interesting. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Chang. Chapter 88. Interesting, I don't understand, but I understand that you are going to die today. Master Zi Ling suddenly took a step forward, and the aura on his body was fully revealed. At this time, the surrounding heaven and earth could not help but tremble. But at this moment, Lin Yu didn't care about all this. He just waved his hand casually, with a bit of contempt and ridicule in his eyes. What can the three-clawed king dragon do? After all, it is just a divine dragon. They are just the lowest end alien beasts in the family. My space-time beast has space-time attributes, so it may not have no chance of winning against your three-clawed king dragon. The old beggar stood between the two sides. He just waved his hands so gently. The three-clawed king dragon above the void actually began to tremble violently at this moment. Then, both sides heard the gentle words from the old man's mouth. A word came out. Retreat. The space-time beast did not feel anything strange, but at this moment, the body of the three-clawed king dragon began to tremble involuntarily, and his expression was filled with a look of panic, and then he retreated so suddenly. When Master Zi Ling saw the old man in front of him, he had the power of heaven and earth and the power of the bright moon in his every move. Therefore, at this time, Master Zi Ling's eyes could not help but flash a bit of solemnity, and his eyes were fixed on him. Looking at the old man in front of him. This senior, I really admire this junior. May I ask my senior's name? I have no name, a life of freedom, a half-life of madness and glitz, and one person for one. So you don't need to ask me who I am. I'm just an ordinary old beggar in the world, and I'm not worth mentioning at all. As the old beggar spoke, he waved his hand casually. At this time, after hearing what the old beggar said, Lin Yu's pupils flashed with a strange light. At this time, he couldn't help but he raised his eyebrows slightly towards the old beggar. At this time, he half squinted his eyes, and some strange colors flashed in his eyes. It's weird, it's really weird. A playful smile appeared on the corner of the old beggar's mouth, and then he shook his head gently, and then turned around and left. At this time, after Lin Yu saw the old beggar like this, he glanced in the direction where the old beggar was leaving. There seemed to be some complex colors flashing in his eyes. He half squinted his eyes, and finally he was like this. Frowned slightly. And just a moment later, after seeing the old man leaving, Master Zi Ling turned his head and glanced coldly at Lin Yu, with a hint of sneer at the corner of his mouth, and in his eyes a bit of cold murderous intent flashed through. Boy, I see what else you have to say now. You will definitely die today. As I said, no one can keep you. After Lin Yu heard Master Zi Ling say this, a slight sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth, and a look of contempt flashed in his eyes before he said, It's ridiculous, it's extremely ridiculous. If you want to kill me, I'm afraid I don't have that ability yet. But at this time, for some unknown reason, the three-clawed king dragon suddenly got back into the body of Master Zi Ling, and he secretly transmitted messages to Master Zi Ling. Don't do anything to this person again, otherwise you will make that senior unhappy. If you provoke that senior, you are responsible for what will happen next. The voice was cold and hoarse, but it also revealed a kind of majesty. At this moment, after hearing the voice, Master Zi Ling's eyes were filled with a look of unwillingness. Is it possible to let that kid go like this? I'm not willing to do it. I can't help it. Rather than offending that person, I would rather make you feel unwilling. Anyway, if you want to kill him, I won't do it. Don't forget that there is no contractual relationship between the two of us. I stay with you just to help you. After Master Zi Ling heard what the three-clawed king dragon said, He was so angry that his fists clenched. A few chills flashed in his eyes, and the cold and murderous intent in his body was quietly released at the beginning. Come out. Asshole, you are a complete and utter bastard, believe it or not. Believe it or not. Are you going to kill me? But don't you want to think about it, can you really kill me? Stop dreaming and wishing here, it's simply ridiculous. In the lazy voice of the three-clawed king dragon, there was a kind of contempt that seemed to come from this nature. And at this moment, a powerful and vast aura suddenly surged from a distance. After feeling this breath, Zi Ling's face began to look ugly. Although he was unwilling to do so, there was nothing he could do. After all, it was such a troubled time, and the old man was too mysterious. Even now, I still don't know who his true identity is. Boy, I'll give you half an hour to leave quickly. If you don't leave within half an hour, I will definitely kill you even if I risk my life. At this moment, the corner of Lin Yu's mouth also evoked a hint of sneer. He knew that once this guy said this, it would prove that he was a slingshot to the old man, so at this time, Lin Yu had a playful smile on his lips. If you want to kill me, how easy is it? It's easy to make me leave. A few days ago, you should have captured a strange beast, the northern bear. You just need to obediently hand over the northern bear. Then I can leave peacefully. Master Zi Ling's fists clenched loudly, but he could clearly feel that the Wuji sex people seemed to be rushing towards him very quickly. If he forced himself to touch this little guy, he might really I will recruit your old man again. Once something happens to you and you fight against the Wuji sect, you will have no chance of winning. After Master Zi Ling thought of this, a bit of cold light flashed in his eyes, and a cold murderous intention began to quietly hit him. Then, he suddenly jumped up, and he used the three-clawed king dragon. He wanted to forcefully overwhelm Lin Yu. However, the qualifications of the mere three-clawed king dragon were far inferior to those of the space-time beast, so at this time, Lin Yu just waved it casually, with a slight sneer on his lips. That's all. It's ridiculous to say that you want to overwhelm me with such pressure. I think you are just talking nonsense. It's extremely ridiculous. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he waved his hand suddenly, and a powerful force spread out from his cuffs, hitting Genren Zi Ling straight on the chest. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 89. The Mud Bodhisattva still has 3 points of anger, not to mention that Master Zi Ling is still alone. At this time, a bit of coldness flashed in the eyes of Master Zi Ling, and the murderous intention on his body began to quietly float away. When the cold killing intent came out, everyone instantly felt as if the temperature around them had dropped several degrees. Boy, don't think that you have someone's backing. You can do whatever you want now. I will leave you here today. If you dare to do this again, I will have to kill you. The killing intent in Master Zi Ling was unreservedly displayed, and his eyes were staring at Lin Yu. At this time, the corner of Lin Yu's mouth was aroused with a bit of sneer. His eyes were full of contempt and ridicule. What a strong tone. Today I want to see how you kill me. Today I really refuse to accept it. I will fight with you for this breath. At this time, the tense atmosphere around the two people spread, and there seemed to be a smell of gunpowder around them. At this moment, Master Zi Ling suddenly jumped up. His speed was extremely fast. With just one breath of 1 billion, time had already arrived in front of Lin Yu, and then the three-clawed king dragon jumped up. He was suddenly summoned like this. At this time, not to mention Lin Yu, even the three-clawed king dragon's pupils were full of surprise after seeing this scene. A bit of confusion flashed in the three-clawed king dragon's eyes, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. Didn't I tell you just now? I won't help you with this matter. The old man just now has an extraordinary identity. He most likely has an ancient dragon spirit in his body, so I can't take this risk. I also hope you can understand this matter, so let's put it aside for the time being, and you must never summon me again. And at this moment, after hearing what the three-clawed king dragon said, Master Zi Ling felt a bit of unwillingness in his eyes. At this time, the murderous intention on his body quietly emerged. When he came out, his fists clenched loudly. "Asshole, are you going to abandon me like this? You bastard, speak up." At this time, after the three-clawed king dragon heard what Master Zi Ling said, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. At this moment, the three-clawed king dragon was thinking, this big brother is nothing more than a battle. It seems that I have done something that I am sorry for you, but in fact it does not seem to be the case. At this moment, the three-clawed king dragon was also in a fit of tears, with a bitter smile on the corner of his mouth and a look of helplessness in his eyes. "You are not from my dragon clan, so naturally you don't know what the previous bloodline pressure means, but I can tell you clearly that the bloodline pressure is not such a simple thing." "That's it?" "Well, because of the pressure of blood, I can only exert less than 30% of my strength in front of him." The three-clawed king dragon was also on the verge of crying for a while. A bitter smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a look of helplessness flashed in his eyes. At this time, the three-clawed king dragon had a look of helplessness on his face. At this moment, after hearing what the three-clawed king dragon said, Master Zi Ling couldn't help but half squinted his eyes, and a few complex colors flashed in his eyes. "Are you telling the truth? Are you sure you're not lying to me? Why do I feel that what you said is a bit strange?" A helpless smile appeared on the corner of the three-clawed king dragon's mouth, and his eyes were filled with a look of helplessness. "If you have to think so, then I am very helpless, but I can tell you clearly that this is how things are. If you think it is a little strange, it is just because you are human beings and I am a dragon. After all, the reason is that our races are not connected in all aspects, and there is no other reason." After hearing what the three-clawed king dragon said, Zi Ling's eyes flashed with something strange. After a moment, he couldn't help but frown slightly. Although he didn't want to believe it, he couldn't help but frown. Seeing that the three-clawed king dragon had spoken to this extent, he was unwilling to change, but he had to believe it. Some strange colors flashed in the eyes of Master Zi Ling, and then he frowned slightly. A sense of vastness came between heaven and earth, and a bit of helplessness flashed in the eyes of Master Zi Ling. Meaning? Lin Yu looked at Master Zi Ling's expression, which was cloudy and uncertain for a while. A bit of confusion flashed through his eyes at that time, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly, and a flash of confusion flashed in his eyes. "A bit strange. If you want to fight, then fight. If you want to fight, fight to the fullest. What are you doing now? What's the point of it? Stop being a mother-in-law here and do it quickly." After hearing what Lin Yu said, Master Zi Ling was so angry that he almost vomited out a mouthful of blood and passed out. At this time, Master Zi Ling glanced at Lin Yu coldly, with a flash in his eyes. After a few minutes of coldness, the murderous intent on his body began to gradually emerge, and a slight sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Little guy, you really have some courage. Today you have to pay the price for your stupidity and ignorance." At this time, Lin Yu heard what Zi Ling said and the corners of his mouth were raised with a bit of sneer, his eyes were full of contempt and mockery, and he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly, and then he rolled his eyes at Zi Ling in annoyance. "The three-clawed dragon didn't help you, and you still think you have a chance of winning. I'm very curious." At this time, Zi Ling's pupils suddenly enlarged after hearing what Lin Yu said, and a bit of disbelief flashed in his eyes. His eyes were staring at Lin Yu, and a bit of cold light flashed in his eyes, and a bit of cold momentum on his body was also suddenly attacking. At this time, he had a bit of playful smile on his lips, and a bit of playfulness flashed in his eyes. He turned his head and looked at the elder, and the coldness in his eyes began to become more and more obvious. "Great Elder, if you can't deal with these little people, then there will be no point in doing many things in the future." Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chang. Chapter 90. 3 black lines appeared on the Great Elder's forehead, and he was speechless for a while. At this moment, he was thinking, "You guys have to fight over this matter, but why do you have to involve me? This is another trick of mine. Who messed with who?" However, although the Great Elder was thinking so in his heart at this time, he did not dare to say it openly. At this time, he just smiled like this, and then suddenly took a step forward, and the Great Elder put the clothes on his body. That cold aura was exuded without reservation. At this time, after Lin Yu felt the aura of the Great Elder, even he had to admit that this person who had the master of the domain and a level of alien beast was very powerful in terms of strength and all aspects. Good. Lin Yu half squinted his eyes fixed on the Great Elder. "Are you sure you want to fight me? You have to think about this, otherwise I'm afraid you will regret it." After the Great Elder heard what Lin Yu said, he suddenly smiled. A bit of joking flashed in his eyes, and a hint of sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Don't forget, this is still the TNG section. What kind of storms do you think you can stir up with your strength? Let me tell you, if you surrender now, it will be the best ending for you. Listen to me, just a word of advice, stop making trouble like this, it won't do you any good." At this time, Lin Yu heard it. After the Great Elder said this, some complicated colors flashed in his eyes, and then he frowned slightly. At this moment, he half squinted his eyes. "Then you mean that I should leave now? But why do you think I should leave now?" After hearing what Lin Yu said, the Great Elder's eyes flashed with some complex colors, and then he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. "What do you want? If you don't leave now, I'm afraid you will get into a lot of trouble. If that happens, it will be ridiculous." At this time, Lin Yu had no idea what the Great Elder meant now. Some complicated colors flashed in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. "It's useless to say more. You must return that Beiming bear to me. That Beiming bear must be mine." Lin Yu's gaze was as blazing as a torch, and his eyes were fixed on the Great Elder. His words were quite irresistible. At this time, the murderous intent in the Great Elder suddenly appeared. "Beiming Xiang, this is the treasure that our sect worked hard to get, how can we give it to you?" At this time, Lin Yu suddenly laughed, "Ha ha ha, it's so ridiculous. There are 3 northern bears in total. After all 3 northern bears were severely injured by me, they were scattered everywhere and were attacked by you. These guys took advantage of this, and now you still dare to tell me this. I really admire your shamelessness." Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the Great Elder, and a bit of murderous intent flashed in his eyes, and the murderous intent on his body began to become more and more obvious. At this time, some complex colors flashed in the eyes of the Great Elder, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. "Boy, I think you are toasting instead of eating as a punishment. Since you want to seek death so much, if I can't, it's really unjustifiable to kill you." The Great Elder waved his big hand, and then the fire spirit beast appeared directly in front of everyone. At this time, the spiritual power around the fire spirit beast seemed to be vaguely burned. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with complicated colors, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. This old guy's fire spirit beast looks a bit extraordinary. It is indeed a beast at the level of the lord of this domain. It is indeed not an ordinary beast. It can be compared with it. It's just that sometimes the beast in this domain, what about the main level alien beasts? At this time, Lin Yu's fighting spirit was overwhelming. A violent and domineering power suddenly emitted from his body, and then the space-time beast suddenly stepped forward, and the space around the space beast there was a vague feeling of collapse. At this time, the great elder couldn't help but half squinted his eyes, with some complicated colors in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. This space-time beast is indeed extraordinary. It is indeed a space-time beast. It cannot be compared with this ordinary mortal thing. If it is such an ordinary mortal thing, it is not said that it is in front of the fire spirit beast now. He is so arrogant and domineering, I am afraid that he has been trembling with fear. When the great elder thought of this, a strange color appeared in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. Even he had to admit that the space beast was really not that simple at this time. An old beggar in the distance just looked at the situation in front of him. He couldn't help but shake his head slightly at that time. A strange color flashed in his eyes, and then he sighed leisurely. Oh, it's hard to say it all, it's hard to say it all. I just managed to get the situation over, but now this little guy is like this again. What should I do? When the old beggar thought of this, he smiled bitterly, and a hint of helplessness flashed in his eyes. After a moment, the old beggar suddenly moved sideways, and then appeared beside Lin Yu in the next second. The elder and Zi-Ling Genren looked at the old beggar, and a solemn look flashed in their eyes. At this moment, they stared at the old beggar, and the cold murderous intent on their bodies was revealed without reservation. Asshole, it's so hateful, so hateful. This is what Zi-Ling Genren thought in his heart at the moment, but he dared not say it out loud. Zi-Ling Genren took a deep breath, calmed down his mood a little, and then turned his head and glanced at the elder, with a playful smile on his lips. Seniors are certainly powerful, but they have repeatedly tried to forcibly interfere in the affairs of us juniors. I'm afraid it's a bit unreasonable.